In a recent video I happened to mention an extraordinary action that took place during World War II in which a lieutenant colonel, a lieutenant and a sergeant using just one anti-tank gun were able to do an extraordinary amount of damage to the enemy. And in this video, which has been sponsored by The Great Courses Plus, but more of that later, I'm going to expand on this extraordinary action that took place in North Africa as part of the Second Battle of El Alamein. If you want to look it up, it's sometimes known as the Action of Kidney Ridge, or more commonly it's known as the Snipe action. And the hero of this story is one Lieutenant Colonel Victor Bulla Turner. He had a tough act to follow in his brother who'd won the Victoria Cross in World War I, alas, posthumously. Victor himself became an officer in 1918, too late to do much in World War I, but in World War II he came to the fore. And on this day, which is the 26th of October 1942, the fourth day of the Second Battle of El Alamein, if someone just says the Battle of El Alamein, they mean the Second Battle of El Alamein, which is far more significant than the first. It was the big turning point in the war. The Commonwealth forces had fought back and forth across the North African desert, but this was the time when they finally were going to at least the beginning of the end for the Axis forces. Churchill himself said, before El Alamein we never had a victory, after we never had a defeat. That's not exactly true, but if you look at the graph of things going quite well badly, there was a definite downward trend, and then you had El Alamein, and then things were broadly. So I think what Churchill was talking about was the best fit lines of the two parts of that graph, with El Alamein at the trough. So General Montgomery is now in command. A lot of people will say that he wasn't really the architect of the defeat of Rommel, and that he was just the lucky guy, happened to be holding the baton. The guy just happened to be in command when the inevitable final victory of the Commonwealth forces took place, his predecessors having done all the groundwork for him. But anyway, that's not what this video is about. So our man is being briefed about what he's going to have to do, and it's a tough brief, and he realizes that this might be a bit of a death or glory, down to the last man and the last shell operation, and others seem to be in agreement. This could be not far off a suicide mission, but well, it was the task that he was given, so he was going to do his best. He was commander of the Prince Consort's Own, I always find that difficult to say, Rifle Brigade 2nd Battalion, or 2RB as he normally referred to it for short in his reports. So you need to know a little bit about the Battle of El Alamein, which I do mention in some of my other videos, including one about military deceptions. No, so I should point over there, shouldn't I? I always get it wrong, because I'm in the wrong way around, you see, in the monitor. Anyway, in order to get forward, the large forces attacking in the north had to get through a huge enemy minefield. And the plan was to do this by creating just thin lanes. And Turner's battalion was given the task of keeping one of these lanes open, and that's what they'd been doing all night. There was an intense artillery barrage, and people had gone forwards to clear these paths, and then they had to get queues of troops and equipment through these narrow lanes all at night, and of course all under enemy observation and fire. So it was a very difficult task, but they had managed it. They created the lanes and they'd got a very large number of forces forward. But it's night time and people are not really sure where everyone is. And Turner himself was crucially not sure where an armoured brigade that was meant to be supporting him was, or the 51st Highlanders, a very significant and experienced division of the British Army that had done a lot of fighting in North Africa. They were meant to be around somewhere doing something, but where exactly were they doing exactly what? What were their orders? And he was just not sure enough of his position, so he sent his second in command to get the guys moving forward, bring them up to the start line, whilst he went to Brigade HQ to find out exactly what the blinking flip was going on. And it seems that when he came back, he was really not all that much the wiser, but he was told that there'd be a creeping barrage that would give him cover going forwards, and that he was to follow that creeping barrage. It was meant to go along a particular line in a particular angle, and it didn't. It was over 30 degrees out, but his orders were to just go and follow it anyway, so he did that. And he could hardly see a thing, because not only is it at night, but also, in his words, the top 18 inches of soil were fine dust that just got stirred up by his passing column and into a pea soup of fog, so you could hardly see your hand in front of your face. And he was trying to read the odometer, the odometer, the clock, as we call them in Britain, that measures distance of his jeep, and by that use that as a gauge for how far they'd gone along the compass bearing. And so he was supposed to be at this position that was codenamed Snipe. Now, there's a lot of shooting in this action, and you may think that snipe, as in sniper, as in you're meant to be shooting, and that the sniper, the word sniper means a man in the army who camouflages himself, waits for a long time, and then makes very difficult long-distance shots. Actually, no. That snipe was simply the water bird. A waterfowl is a type of thing, sort of long bill. It's a wader. Lives in marshes and amongst reeds and so forth, and they are notoriously difficult to hunt. So people would hunt them for sport. So if you were a sniper, someone who was capable of hunting snipe, then you were a man to be reckoned with, because you had to be very good at camouflage, you had to be very patient, and they fly very erratically. They're very difficult to hit, so you had to be a damn fine shot. Indeed, I recently read that in the American Scouting Association, they used to get Boy Scouts to go on snipe hunts, knowing that they would almost certainly fail. But it was a rite of passage. It's a character building thing to try to do something that's extraordinarily difficult. And experiencing failure is character building. So do that a bit. So there you go. There's a wonderful quote. He's so wet you could shoot snipe off him. I love that. Anthony Powell, A Question of Upbringing. I've adapted it slightly. Wet? Is he wet? Swans keep landing on him by mistake. I suppose I'm going to have to explain now what wet means as well as sniper. So sniper is actually someone who hunts snipe, which you do for sport, because they're not for eating or whatever. They're not a horrendous pest or hazard. They're not gangs of snipe terrorizing the world that have to be wiped out. No. You do it because it's difficult. And if you're wet, it means you dampen the enthusiasm of others. So if you've got some firebrand who says, "Hey everyone, come on, we can do this thing, let's all go, it'll be great, what do you say?" You get the wet guy who says, "Well, I'm not sure, I don't think we're really supposed to do that. And by the time we get there, it might be quite late, there might not be time to do all that much, and it's very expensive, and oh, well, don't be so wet." You see, that's what the wet person... Although, I could say don't be wet, but maybe this world needs wet people, otherwise it'll be run by the firebrands and tinderboxes and we'll all be on fire. Anyway, bit of a digression there. So, snipe is a code name based on a bird. So there was another feature in the area that was called woodcock, for instance. That was to the north. But was he at snipe? He couldn't really see a lot. His navigation was difficult. They were being attacked. They were being bombed by the Luftwaffe, and they suffered some losses. Two of the Porty lorries crashed into each other, and they were carrying anti-tank guns, and so that was two of his guns that he wasn't going to be able to get forward into position. He had a motorised battalion, and this was not many men. It was only about 90 men, but he had a lot of firepower. Crucially, he had a full complement of 16 6-pounder anti-tank guns. These were now the latest anti-tank gun being used by the British Army, as well as Vickers guns, and he had a couple of scout platoons of carriers armed with Bren guns and the like. Carriers as in universal carriers, little armoured, fully tracked vehicles. So there were not very many men, but this little unit had a lot of firepower, a lot of punch. And attached to it were another 11 anti-tank guns and some sappers of the Royal Artillery. And his task was to go forward, find this area, Snipe, and fortify it, turn it into an all-round island of defence, which would then act as what they call a pivot of manoeuvre for a tank attack, which would then use it as a sort of safeguard on one flank and sweep round and win. That was the plan. But they didn't realise quite how many enemy tanks there were in the area. Anyway, after he'd gone about 1.5 miles, he reckoned, in roughly the right direction, he spoke to his OP, that's what he referred to, which I think stands for observation post. It's what most people would call a forward observation officer, a man who's in contact with the Royal Artillery, and they are presumably zeroed in somewhere. They know where they are on the map, and so they can accurately fire at Snipe. They can, if they know exactly where they are, they can look at where Snipe is meant to be and do the calculations and fire one smoke round to land on Snipe. And this he ordered, and the smoke round went off only about 300 yards from him. So he thought, well, That's good enough. So he got his very pistol, a little flare launcher, put in the colour of flare which signalled success, and fired that off. So he had signalled, this was shortly after midnight, success. I have found where I'm supposed to be. It later turned out that he probably was about 1,000 yards out of where he was meant to be, but what the hell. You could say that wherever he was, that was Snipe. So what was it? Well, it was a feature about 1,000 yards by about 350, roughly kidney-shaped, that was made up of very soft sand, and it had been used by the Germans as an engineering dump, and it had a bunker which they converted into a command an HQ point. That was fairly useful, and it was very easy to dig in because of this soft sand, but it didn't afford a great deal of cover. There was soft cover, camel thorn bushes and tamarisk tussocks, but there was no hard cover. There were no great hard rocks to hide behind, or big ridges and folds of the land. It's described as a depression, but you can see from this sketch map that he deployed his anti-tank guns pointing in all different directions, you see. So there aren't many anti-tank guns pointing in any one direction, because this had to be an all-round defence. But there are ones deployed quite near the centre of that depression, and 6-pounders are not huge guns. Well, this is a 6-pounder. It's not a tall gun by any means, and they're digging them in down. So if you dug in a 6-pounder and you can still see from the middle of a depression, out of that depression, it's not much of a depression. He does, in his accounts, say that the deluge, that's the word he uses, of enemy direct fire mainly passed over their heads. So they were just a little bit down, but crucially very well camouflaged, and they were able to dig in quite quickly because of the soft sand. So that was all good. On the other hand, this soft sand was very difficult to move around in. It was very soft, and you kicked up great clouds of dust. So there you are, staggering around in this soft sand, trying to avoid thorn bushes and the like, and you were a very conspicuous target to the enemy. You couldn't move stealthily at any speed through this landscape. But that's what they had. So that's what they made use of. So they created their pivot of manoeuvre. And pretty soon they heard the chug, chug, chug of enemy tanks out there in the darkness somewhere. Now, there was a scouting mission sent out by the C Company's carriers went out, and they encountered, about 15 Italians who promptly surrendered. And then after a bit they met 150 Italians who, it seems, also were very keen on surrendering. But they were quite far out. They were about 1.5 miles away from their own lines, and they're just a few carriers. So they had to say, I'm terribly sorry, but we just don't have the facilities to accommodate you all. But do try again later. And they then carried on scouting, taking their first smaller number of prisoners with them, and they came across what they referred to as a Liga. I think most people would say lager these days, but anyway, a big military car park of German vehicles, including lots of tanks, which they then started shooting up with their Bren guns. After a while, the Germans got annoyed and started shooting back, and they were forced to withdraw because they set fire to a number of lorries, which then lit up the landscape with the blaze. So then their positions were revealed to the Germans, and the return fire started getting a bit accurate. So they got out of there, and it seems that some of the Italian prisoners, I'm afraid to say, got caught in the crossfire and shot. Anyway, they withdrew, but they reported their findings to Turner, who realised, oh, there are really quite a lot of German tanks really quite close to us then. That's not good news. Anyway, these tanks came on in the darkness, about 20 of them or so in line ahead, and I haven't found any source that identifies what sort of tank they were. Presumably it was really dark, nobody could see, so tanks of some sort, about 20 of them in line ahead, and they held fire until the enemy was 30 yards away. That can you imagine a column of tanks coming at you? You've got an anti-tank gun and you hold fire. And obviously darkness is one of the reasons. You don't want to fire too early on and miss in the darkness, but 30 yards, I would have thought you could aim just using your ears at that distance. Anyway, they opened fire. Boom! The first tank immediately bursts into flames, which presumably again illuminates the landscape a bit. They then fire in about 200 yards. They knock out a self-propelled gun. I think most of the self-propelled guns were 38T chassis with captured Russian guns mounted on them. And they saw off this attack. in the darkness. So someone bailed out of that lead tank and found a trench to get into, and for the next several hours was sniping through the night at their position until one of the riflemen, British riflemen, crawled out there and silenced him with a grenade. So that was the first attack in the darkness, but it was to be the first of many. They were already down to just 17 anti-tank guns, not because they'd had anti-tank guns knocked out in action, but 27 anti-tank guns had set out, 19 had now got to the position and dug in. The others were lost, had crashed into each other in the darkness, were somewhere else. So with these military operations, you've got to factor in that a lot of forces, so they'd lost about a third of their anti-tank guns already before a shot has actually been fired. Just getting into position in difficult terrain, in darkness, with inadequate navigation, meant that they'd lost a third of their forces before they'd even fired a shot. So the carriers realise that they're too vulnerable out there, and they pull back into the position and join everyone else. He's got Vickers machine guns supporting him and some riflemen too, but not very many. The anti-tank guns are the principal defence of Snipe. Now it took them about 3.5 hours to unload all the lorries. Most of the lorries then departed because when the light was to come in the morning, the lorries would have been hideously vulnerable, not armoured, and would have stuck out like sore thumbs. And so they almost all got out, leaving them in this island where they would not be supplied for quite some while. So they would have to last on what ammunition and food and water they had, and information, of course. And they had with them just the one OP, just the one forward observation officer. In the accounts of this action, I read again and again of tanks withdrawing not completely out of range, nor completely out of sight, but just to hull down positions away off. And it seems that they felt themselves reasonably safe. Anyway, that's what the enemy did. They withdrew to some hull down positions some way off in the darkness. And there they were definitely safe. And then the moon came out and more observations were made, and they could see that there were really quite a lot of German, particularly German, but also Italian vehicles to the north, which was somewhat disconcerting. The sun came up around 0600 hours, and they took stock of their position and realised that a lot of their guns were not very well sighted. They were in horribly exposed positions and were going to have to be moved and dug in somewhere else. So they got on with that pretty quickly. The enemy, meanwhile, were observed on the move to the north, and it seems that the enemy had not spotted them, hadn't really worked out where they were. They were therefore presumably pretty well camouflaged, and they opened fire with their anti-tank guns, and at this point they knocked out 6 enemy tanks, damaged a couple more, and then there was another action, the other side of Snipe, firing off in the other direction. They managed to knock out another 8 tanks and maybe 2 self-propelled guns. And so, well, that was quite a feather in the cap. And so now their position is surrounded by burning wrecks of the enemy. This is quite significant because they then started getting shelled. And some of this fire was coming from the Germans, but they realised after a bit that no, this isn't all German fire. Some of this is incoming from the east. They'd heard more tanks turn up, and they thought, that'll be the 24th Armoured Brigade turning up to the right. There are guys. They're mainly in Shermans. There are some Crusaders, mainly Shermans. And unfortunately, it was what today is called a friendly fire or a blue-on-blue incident. And in his account, Turner says, and you have to admire this sort of turn of phrase, there really was every excuse for this. You see, there they were, surrounded by enemy tanks, admittedly knocked out tanks, and there had been some 88mm shells being fired eastward, roughly from that sort of general direction. And so it was a reasonable conclusion that the fire was coming from Turner's position, and the friendly Shermans started shelling their position. And at this point, he lost 3 anti-tank guns knocked out. And at this point also, the observation post goes out of action. In Turner's account, it seems that he was killed because of the bombardment, but in other accounts, He went to do some scouting independently and was just never seen again. Was he killed? There's one version where he was killed. There's another version where he was captured. There's another version of the story where he actually found another position with another unit somewhere else entirely. But then surely he would have turned up the next day or the day after that, wouldn't he? Anyway, the forward observer disappeared, and his loss was to be sorely felt by Turner. More than once he signalled, "Our crying need is for an OP." Some artillery cover would have been very useful, but unfortunately he had no artillery cover that was coming from his position to be guided, to be called in on targets of his choice. So he's already suffering more casualties, and it's only the morning, and he's going to have to last all day. Now, there were supplies in a convoy of more food, more water, more ammunition, and they were supposed to come to him, but they didn't. All day they were back there to the east, safely out of artillery range of the enemy, and it was deemed just too dangerous to send a column of vulnerable lorries to resupply him. So he was going to have to make do with just what he had for at least one day. Surely he could hold out one day, right? How much did the enemy got? And how much would the enemy commit to attacking his one small position? Quite a lot, as it turned out. Now at this point I would like to say a few words on the topic of the British 6-pounder anti-tank gun, and they are these. It was pretty damn good, and I'm absolutely sick of hearing that this British gun or that British gun was rubbish because, well, the argument seems to run that it was British and therefore it was rubbish, and that some other gun was brilliant because it was German, and somehow that seems to be reason enough. Well, I'm here to say that the 6-pounder gun was very good. In fact, it outperformed the 75mm gun on a Panther. Yes, a Panther. I'm going to say it again. Yes, on a Panther. Now, of course, there were several different types of ammunition that the Panther gun could use, and several that the British 6-pounder could use. The British were developing more and more and better armor-piercing shells for it throughout the war. The later version had a higher velocity and a barrel break and so forth. And later they got the discarding sabot round that was really amazing, although possibly not all that accurate, but its penetrating ability was just amazing. But yes, broadly speaking, the 6-pounder performed better than the Panther gun. And it also performed substantially better than the 75mm gun, which was its replacement on a lot of vehicles like the Churchill tank, for instance. Although the British continued putting 6-pounders on Churchills right until the end of the war, because the armour-piercing capability of that gun was so much better, yes, I'll say that again, so much better than the 75mm American-compatible multi-purpose gun. Now, the reason that the Churchills went over to the 75 was that it had a really good and effective high explosive shell, which the 6-pounder did not. If you want a really good, effective, high explosive shell, then just more caliber, just a bigger shell, a wider, thicker bore is really very useful. And you were never going to get anything brilliant into the 57mm of a 6-pounder. But as an armour-piercing round, as an anti-tank gun, the 6-pounder was good, damn it, so there. And I can go further. The first time the Western Allies ever encountered the Tiger, that was in the desert, and both the two Tigers that they encountered were immediately knocked out by, yes, you guessed it, 6-pounders that were Portee. They were on the back of a lorry. So there you go, a lorry with a 6-pounder on the back of it, bested 2 Tiger tanks. So there. And when the Western Allies first encountered the Panther, that was in Italy, the same thing happened. 6-pounders, boom, took out those Panthers. So let's not hear that any more of this 6-pounders were rubbish nonsense. Anyway, back to the story. So things are not looking good at this point for Lieutenant Colonel Turner and the lads of 2RB. They're surrounded by the enemy and they're being shelled by their own side. Quite disappointingly effectively, in fact. And these people cannot be raised on the radio to call off the barrage. So what do? Well, they get an intelligence officer, load him into a universal carrier, a little armoured battle taxi, and send this zipping off through the desert, I imagine weaving around a bit to avoid being hit, to get to the Shermans and call off the attack. The intelligence officer manages to get there and says that, of course, it's a completely understandable mistake. Anyone could have made it, and there's absolutely no hard feelings at all, but could you please stop killing us? And his request is granted. And at just this point, a new danger is noted because about 1,500 yards away, that's not very far, to the south-southeast are 25 incoming tanks. And these tanks are not any tanks, these are Mark IV Specials, as they were known then. Today we would probably call them a Panzer IV F2. The F2 was the first with the long barrel. This one has the barrel brake at the end, so the early ones had the bulbous barrel brake. It looked like that. And this was the most fearsome tank gun in North Africa at the time. A 75mm high velocity, armor piercing, but it could also fire high explosive gun. And so they've got that lot now coming at them. And what are they going to do now? Well, I'm going to leave it in suspense because it's time for a word from my sponsor. This is, of course, the Great Courses Plus. And just in case you've been under a rock for a while and you don't know what the Great Courses Plus is, it's a website. It's an on-demand subscription service, and you can get access to thousands upon thousands of lectures by distinguished professors from major universities and august bodies like the Smithsonian and the National Geographic, and all sorts of topics. Sometimes they're not that academic, sometimes it's cookery courses and so forth, but there's a lot of history, there's a lot of maths and science and all that sort of stuff. So you're bound to find something, I would have thought, that would interest you. And if you go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/Lindybeige, then you will find details of a free trial that you can take advantage of. And won't that be great? Or you could just click the link in the description to this, which is much easier. And frankly, I prefer you to do that because, well, I want you to live an easy life, a life of luxury and ease. Why do you want to go typing when you don't have to? Click the link in the description. Now, you can watch on all sorts of devices. That's the word, devices. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure about this word devices. I'm sure it means something more specific than I understand. But devices, tablets and computers, of laptops and proper computers and I don't know, sewing machines, all sorts of things. Apparently even telephones these days. Devices you can watch these lectures on. And the glorious thing about these lectures, there's no exams and you can just pick whatever you want. And you don't have to do a whole course. For instance, in the Biology of Human Nature course, I noticed that there were two lectures on hormones, one on how hormones regulate the brain and one on how the brain regulates hormones. And I've been researching hormones for a video that I've been meaning to make for years that's about hormones and one very important misunderstanding that most people seem to have about them. Anyway, so I thought, well, I'll just pop in and take those lectures, those ones that I want. I don't have to do the whole course. It's not like going to a real university where you're expected to do the whole course, not just turn up to the one lecture that you're interested in. No, you just do whatever you want. You can go to any lecture in any course anytime you want and give it a go. And these ones that I saw on hormones, just look at this guy. I mean, wow, what a beard, huh? That's Professor Robert, although I think with that beard he's probably known to his students as Bob. Sapolsky, and frankly I'm jealous of the beard. Now, should you trust this man though? I mean, does he have the caliber of scholar's cradle that will inspire trust in you? Well, he does have his hands quite close together a lot of the time like this, threatening a scholar's cradle, and you could say that maybe when they're just touching like this is a form of scholar's cradle, but I noticed he had a particularly unique technique which I was rather impressed by, which he employed quite often, which is the index finger grasp. Because here it is, you go, whoop, like that, you see, and I go, okay, so he's got his own, he's got his own take on it. So if you've got the most conservative views about how a scholar's cradle should look, then perhaps you won't like his lectures. But if you're, willing to go out on a limb, try something a little bit new, then maybe the index finger grasp is something that will be fine by you. This set, by the way, is a set which I was told got ritually burned after they took it down, and they had a little celebration. We are never using this set again. That's the end of this set. But you can still see recordings of that set saved for posterity in videos like these. So there you go. He's from the University of Stanford, so I hope that's august enough for you. Stanford, I mean, that's good enough for most, I would have thought. So there you go, the Great Courses Plus. Thank you very much for sponsoring me, and now back to the action in the deserts of North Africa, 1942. So they're being attacked, this time by F2s, which are quite formidable tanks. So naturally they're going to want the help of those Shermans, and the Shermans charge forward, and there is a confused battle that goes on for about 25 minutes. Both sides fire smoke. And of course the tanks are stirring up huge amounts of dust, and so visibility is a major part of the problem for both sides. And I have read that the Germans, it seems, were using a new tactic. Exactly how well it worked, I don't know, but they were using a new tactic, which was to fire smoke rounds directly from a tank at an enemy Sherman to blind it. And then several tanks, having seen one of the enemy tanks marked would fire into that patch of smoke. I suppose the idea is they're completely blind because we've put smoke right on them, and admittedly we can't really see where the tank is anymore because it's surrounded by smoke, but we can see a patch of smoke, so we're not as blind as they are, and we're several all cooperating, firing into the smoke. Anyway, after 25 minutes 7 Shermans were knocked out and on fire, and very sensibly, according to Turner, the rest of their unit withdrew back to the ridge, back to hull down position. So that was an expensive exchange, and it showed just how vulnerable those tanks were, because as soon as you move, you draw attention to yourself. As soon as you get out there, you're a big high-sided target that just attracts fire, whereas the anti-tank guns could be well camouflaged, stay still, stay low, pick your targets. You can see better because you've got eyes that are looking through air rather than through periscopes or little slits. So finding targets and judging distances and so forth is easier. Yes, the tanks proved very vulnerable, and 7 of them were wrecked. And again, Turner is radioing, our crying need is for a gunner, send us a new observation post. And he was told that one was on its way. Unfortunately, though it is thought that he did set out, that gunner never arrived. So the convoy still won't resupply, and at this point the cries of the wounded are being a bit distressing, so 3 carriers are sent back with some severely wounded on board, and on the way one of them takes a direct hit from a 75mm shell and keeps going. So there you go, it's possible to hit a carrier with a 75mm shell directly and not knock it out. I can see how that's possible. A lot of the back end is just slab-sided space, and so the shell it must have been a pretty nasty moment, but they were able to get back with those severely wounded. And the 24th Armoured then withdrew to hull down positions again, so we're back to the situation of a few hours previously. Next attack came from Italian infantry, or rather it would have done. Now there are so many observations being made of the enemy around that it's quite clear that the land must have been fairly flat. Not completely, because people are using folds of the land to make various attacks, but they're able to see troops massing for attack, and they observe a load of Italians who are going to come at them. So rather than wait to be attacked, and if you're largely anti-tank guns, then being attacked by infantry is actually quite a major threat, the carriers were sent out there. And the carrier platoon went out there with Bren guns and broke the attack up before it got going. So the Italians are massing for their attack, and then suddenly they're being Bren gunned from little armoured taxis, and that's it. The fight goes out of them and they scarper. And the Bren guns are also able to brew up a couple of lorries which were towing, yes, 6-pounder anti-tank guns that had presumably been captured off the British not long before. I haven't read anywhere that they were able to salvage any of the ammunition for those guns. I think they probably just thought, we've done enough here, let's get back. So that attack was broken up really before it got anywhere at all. Now there are 2 major attacks from tanks coming next. One from the north was 13 M13s, 13 of this type of tank called the M13. The M13 is very similar to the M14, and the significance of this is that there's one of those at Bovington Tank Museum, and I was there and I did shoot a little bit of footage about the M14.
The Italian M14-41. I must admit, know a huge amount about Italian tanks. The first thing that most people learn about Italian tanks was that they were rubbish. Now, of course, if you've got tanks and the Abyssinian natives that you're up against don't have tanks, then you don't have to have very good tanks for them to think, oh wow, they've got tanks. However, as soon as one of these comes across something like a Valentine or a Matilda, then you'd much rather be in the Valentine or the Matilda. The Valentine and the Matilda were more reliable, much better armoured, although actually for firepower it was about parity. This is a decent gun, and you can see it's got 2 forward-firing machine guns in the hull. The armour on this is not just thin, it's also just bad in almost every way. The plate, the quality of the metal that's made out of is bad, the way it's all bolted and riveted together is rather rickety, and these had a reputation for cracking. If something fairly big, if the armour was overmatched, they say, that is to say it's hit by a shell that has a greater calibre than the thickness of the armour, which is pretty much anything that's going to hit this, then it had a tendency to crack. and that's very disconcerting for the crew. By and large, the harder a piece of armour is, the more likely it is to crack if overmatched. The same thing, this should be said, happened to a lot of German armoured cars. Small German armoured cars often had case-hardened, very, very hard, very brittle, very effective armour. Is really great at getting bullets to ping off and small things, but as soon as anything really big hits it, then it fails catastrophically, and sometimes the entire side of an armoured car could shatter off. These went up against Matildas and, well, they lost. Now, it's very fashionable to say that the Italians were just rubbish soldiers, and it's also more recently fashionable to say, no, actually, a lot of people think that the Italians were rubbish, but actually we know that they were really, really good. I strongly suspect that both of these things are true, in that some Italian soldiers were competent and fought very, very hard, but an awful lot of them did things like surrender in large numbers, and the joke, when I was a small child, the joke was that Italian tanks had 1 gear going forwards and 5 going backwards. Oh, hilarious. No, that is just a joke. It's really a conventional tank that was not quite up to the standards of its day when it went up against the cutting-edge tanks that the British have. I say cutting-edge. Unfortunately, the British, of course, later met the German tanks and realised that perhaps their cutting-edge tanks weren't quite so edge-cutting as they had hoped. So the Italian tank, not all that good, but not so terrible either.
Oh, yes, it seems I really didn't know very much about Italian tanks. That was almost all the digression about thin case-hardened armour and overmatching. No matter, that tank I was standing next to there was the M14, which was the upgraded version of the M13, had slightly better armour, slightly better engine, but really is basically the same sort of tank. Passable gun, and you couldn't say that it was hopelessly outdated. They'd only come out a year or two before. They just weren't all that great, but they weren't all that bad either. I think I made that point. Anyway, there were 13 of those coming at the British, and they had to swing a couple of guns round to meet this attack, and in so doing, those poor blighters drew attention to themselves. As soon as you stood up and tried to move a gun about, you started stirring up dust, drawing attention to yourself, and the incoming fire was pretty nasty, and there was an officer and 3 other ranks killed at that point. But even so, the attack was seen off fairly easily, and 4 of those Italian tanks were busily burning away at this stage. But this, it seems, was a covering attack. It was a two-pronged attack. There were Germans to the south attacking at the same time. 25 to 30 tanks involved now. And they were attacking the Shermans who were to the east. This, it turned out, was a tactical blunder. Now, they were moving eastward towards the Shermans, but they received so much effective fire from Snipe to the north that half of them were then ordered to peel off and attack Snipe. So now the Germans are attacking in 2 different directions. And Turner refers to a bridge term, a cross rough. You know, where you lead to a void and then trump and then lead back from there to another void and trump. So it's a bridge move, and he said that it was a cross rough because the ones that were going towards the tanks were broadside on to the anti-tank guns, and therefore easy targets. And the ones going on towards the anti-tank guns were broadside on to the tanks, and therefore easy targets. I say easy targets. You can imagine it takes a certain amount of faith in your fellows, though, that they're going to ignore the guys who are actually threatening them and are much closer and are coming at them right now, and instead shoot at the further target that are broadside on. So you have to rely on them to keep you safe, while you will keep them safe. But it seemed this happened. And again, German tanks aplenty are brewing up, as they used to say, in the desert. This cross rough happened at about 1,000 yards, and 8 of the tanks are knocked out. But the British in Snipe are still suffering. They're down now to 13 guns, and they're getting very dangerously low on ammunition. So much so that the risk is taken. They put some ammunition in a jeep, which, in order to get to all the various guns, drives out of the soft area of sand and then drives around, delivering ammunition to the various guns, driving around the perimeter. But this, of course, attracts fire. The jeep miraculously got away with this, but there were bullets skipping around the ankles of the guys delivering ammunition the whole time. So that was a pretty hair-raising thing to have to do. And during this action, 6 out of the 9 carriers in C Company have been put out of action. So C Company's carriers are now not a very effective force anymore. It's clear that Snipe is being attacked by very large and unexpectedly large forces of the enemy. And the division commander, Major General Briggs, had a very difficult decision to make at this point. Should he send relief? Should he launch the attack? He wanted to launch the attack. If you remember, it was meant to be a pivot of manoeuvre for this big sweeping attack that was going to win. But it seems that there are now so many German tanks out there that seems like a very expensive and risky thing to try. And it's also very difficult to send out a column to extricate them, to get them out of danger from Snipe. And he thought about it, and he came to the reluctant and difficult conclusion that the best thing to do was actually sit tight and not do anything to rescue Snipe, nor launch the main tank attack at this point. So the gunners at Snipe were just going to have to last some more attacks. Now, at 1300, that's 1 o'clock in the afternoon, another 9 M13s attacked with from the southwest. And perhaps they were lucky, or perhaps they had taken very careful observations. You've got to remember that the anti-tank guns are pointing in all directions, so an attack from any given direction will only be met by a small number of anti-tank guns. And from this particular direction, there was only one anti-tank gun in a position to stop them. And this was manned by one Sergeant Calliston. Now, our hero, Victor Turner, was the man on the spot. He'd been moving around all over the place, and he made sure that he was where the threats were coming. And so he managed to get to that gun and found Calliston on his own. The rest of his crew were either wounded and in a trench, groaning, or had been sent away to fetch more ammunition. So we've got an anti-tank gun, one anti-tank gun to stop an attack by 9 tanks, and he's on his own. So what does the commander do? He steps up and he becomes the loader. So I'll load for you. So you now have a lieutenant colonel acting as loader on an anti-tank gun. And he says, no, wait, hold. Let them come, let them come. Hold your fire. Aim for that lead tank. Hold your fire. Wait for it, wait for it. A lieutenant turned up, who was the commander of that particular platoon of anti-tank guns. He turns up to help out as well. Hold your fire, hold your fire. So now there are 3 guys on the gun. He waits until the enemy's 600 yards away. This is in daylight, don't forget. 600 yards away, that's pretty scary, because you've got a gun that's affected much further than 600 yards, but let's make this first shot count. Anyway, Sergeant Calliston fires at 600 yards, and boom! The first tank brews up, flames everywhere, guys bailing out. And the Vickers machine guns and various Brens and rifles, also in Snipe, are not being merciful with bailing tank crews at this point. There were times in the war when if you saw an enemy tank crew bail out, you might give them a wave. Oh, bad luck, try again later. But at this point, they're not sparing bailing out tank crews, and so they're gunning down the guys who are bailing out as best they can. Brutal, but I suppose necessary at this stage in the war. Anyway, Sergeant Calliston takes aim and fires again. Boom! And again, boom! He brews up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the enemy tanks are now knocked out and ablaze. Absolutely astounding piece of shooting, I think you'll agree. And you'd imagine that 6 out of 9 tanks would cause the 3 remaining tanks to break off the attack. They'd think, okay, but no, they didn't. They were pressing ahead. Is that because they hadn't noticed that the other 6 had been knocked out? I don't know, but press ahead they did. Which was a big problem, because there were 3 enemy tanks coming at them, and they only had 2 rounds left. At this point, it was Lieutenant Toms, I think his name was. So I know where there's some ammunition, and he turned and he has to make his way across this very soft sand, 18 inches of dusty sand coming up to your knees, get through the thorn bushes to a jeep that was 100 yards away, and he knew there was some anti-tank rounds in boxes strapped to the bonnet of that jeep. And he managed to get to that jeep, he managed to get it to start, and then wrestled it through the horrendous ground, and taking machine gun fire the whole time. I believe he was wounded. And the jeep was hit by so much machine gun fire that it burst into flames. So he's now driving a burning jeep on horrendous ground, and it's burning. And I imagine if it's burning, it's probably the front end burning. And that's where all these anti-tank rounds are. But he managed to get it to within 10 yards of the gun. and he then had the unenviable task of getting a load of anti-tank rounds off the front bonnet of a burning Jeep and unstrapping it, because it must have been pretty thoroughly strapped on, I would have thought, and then getting them to the gun. And Sergeant Calliston fired 3 more shots, every one a coconut. Boom, boom, boom. He had knocked out all 9 of the attacking Italian tanks. A hat-trick, shouted, which is a cricketing term. Lots of sporting and gaming terms in his vocabulary, cried Lieutenant Colonel Turner. So that attack by a small miracle had been stopped. Sergeant Calliston was actually nominated for the recommended for the VC for that action. I think he ended up getting the DSO. So that attack had now been stopped miraculously, but that wasn't the last. No, at 1600, 70 tanks were observed milling around in various locations in the area, German and Italian tanks. They did not have the ammunition to see off 70 tanks. So things were looking more and more grim. At 1700, an attack was launched. And this was by German tanks, largely Panzer IVs, and Turner concluded that they were probably the 21st Panzer Division. He didn't know this, he couldn't see from where he was the markings on them, but he concluded that it was probably the 21st Panzer Division because of the way they behaved, which was somewhat incompetently. Now, the 21st Panzer Division was not itself an incompetent unit, but it had just arrived in the area, and so he concluded that they hadn't been told about us, because 7 of them passed by the Snipe position, broadside on, at only 200 yards range, just making stupidly easy targets of themselves. And he thought, well, if they don't know we're here, we're going to take advantage. And so they started firing at them, and again, boom, boom, boom. A 6-pounder will make easy work of a German tank at 200 yards. And they're knocking them out quite easily, and in 25 minutes the action is all over. And he makes another, I suppose you could call it sporting reference. It's a little bit grim. If you're hunting rabbits, you may know that a rabbit, when it comes out of its burrow, tends to pause and look about just as it's coming out of its burrow, and that's an opportunity for a hunter to shoot the bunny. Well, he said that the Vickers gunners got a lot of hits because rather than the Germans bailing out by opening the hatch and diving out and running, they would open the hatch, pause a second, and then look out to see what the situation is before bailing out. And in that hesitation, they were then shot by the British gunners. So the Panzer Division is losing crewmen to that moment of hesitation at the mouth of the burrow. So how many were knocked out? Well, there are multiple claims. There were several. The Royal Artillery units towards the eastern end of Snipe were firing away, and it seems that there are claims from both units. So, but it's thought that about nine tanks were knocked out in that engagement. It lasted about 25 minutes. But that still wasn't the end of it. They got attacked again. This time, 15 Mark III, 15 Panzer IIIs were attacking. And these are described in Turner's account as hesitating. And in others, they're described as making very good use of every little fold in the land, making observations, weaving their way in, getting as close as they can, exposing themselves as little as possible. So these are competent tankers, but still, they've been quite clearly given the orders to attack this position, which the Germans clearly are convinced is a very important one. So you've got 15 tanks coming at you, and again, from the angle, you can only get a few guns to bear. In fact, there were just 2 manned by Sergeant Hines and Sergeant Miles. And one later they were able to swing a third one round and get 3 guns into action against this attack. So these are Panzer IIIs, another good, workhorse tank, admired by many people. I've done a video, in fact.
Here we have the Panzer III.
No, we don't have time for that now. Look, if you want to find out more about the Panzer III, there's another video entirely that you can watch about that. I'm talking about this particular attack on the Snipe position. Now, this was quite a competent attack, and it seems that the Germans now had a pretty shrewd idea about where a lot of these anti-tank guns were, and they were firing their machine guns quite effectively at those positions. And Sergeant Miles was hit and managed to make it back into a trench, at which point Sergeant Swan, who was about 30 yards away, having his gun having been knocked out, he was near the HQ. He then crawled out with machine gun bullets whizzing close over his head, managed to get to the gun, managed to load it, and popped up and bang! Knocked out the lead Panzer III that was attacking. And this then stalled the German attack for a moment. The machine gun deluge of bullets coming in ebbed a little bit, and then buoyed up by this, some of the gunners who had been hiding in slit trenches nearby, they got out and recrewed the guns, and the attack was seen off. One of the other Panzer IIIs was knocked out by all three of the 6-pounders who were now firing, all hitting it at the same time. And I can imagine this must happen a lot. It's something which has cropped up in games that I've played. You've got, I don't know, maybe you're playing some fantasy thing, and there are 3 orcs charging 3, elf archers or something, and it's this elf archer's turn, and the player for that elf archer says, oh, well, I'm going to shoot that orc, and he rolls some dice, and he shoots the orc, and the orc falls over, and then it's the next guy's turn. Oh, I'm going to shoot that orc. But in fact, what's going to happen in reality is that one of those orcs is the mean, fast-looking one who's coming right at you with an axe, and all 3 of them will go, shunk! And they're going to shoot at the same one. So you've got 1 orc down with 3 arrows in him, and the other 2 orcs then close with the archers. Well, that's what happened here. They all picked the same threatening tank and destroyed it much more thoroughly than was entirely necessary. Fortunately, though, the attack was seen off, and during it, and there are a number of accounts that mention this quite definitely. There was a 6-pounder shell that went in through the front armour of a Panzer III, all the way through the Panzer III, out the other side, and hit the tank behind. Frustratingly, I haven't found any source which says what this hit the tank behind actually means, but I get the impression that it knocked out the tank behind. So a single round took out 2 Panzer IIIs. Because otherwise, how would they know that they'd hit it, and how was it of any consequence? Under those circumstances, if you're a gunner and you shoot, you're looking down the sight and you shoot all the way through a tank that's in front of you, you wouldn't know what happened to the shell as it came out the back, unless perhaps the tank behind burst into flames as well. Oh, wow, we must have hit it. 2 for 1. Anyway, the tank came to a halt, and that was pretty handy, because the anti-tank guns only had 3 rounds left each. So what were they going to do if they got attacked, again? Well, the Panzer IIIs withdrew only about 500 yards away. It doesn't seem to me that would be very far away. Got to hull down positions, still kept up some machine gun fire, but weren't any more aggressive than that for the rest of the time. So at this point, things seem absolutely hopeless for Turner, and he gives the order for all code books and secret documents to be burned, which itself was a code to HQ to understand that meant that he was going to withdraw. Once he'd burned all the code books, they then couldn't use any of the codes in their radio transmissions. So instead they got by with what he called veiled language. So when, for instance, they were discussing when relief might come or when they might pull out, they were saying things like, oh, at dinner time. Oh, really? Early dinner or late dinner? Oh, the fashionable time. 9 o'clock. And they're hoping that any listening Germans wouldn't understand what this veiled language meant. But there you go. The richness of British culture made it possible for a certain amount of veiled language to get across a lot of the crucial pieces of information that were necessary. 1930 hours came, and the enemy mercifully pulls out. They thought that another attack was coming for sure, and if another attack had come, then he thought he was going to be overrun, but they pull out. And actually 1930 was around sunset, and this was a really bad choice of timing for the Germans, because the sun tends to set in the west, and so they were heading west, and they were beautifully silhouetted against the setting sun. And these anti-tank gunners, who had just 3 rounds left, thought, well, we're going to be pulling out anyway. might as well just fire off a few shots. I mean, they're a long way. They're about 2,200 yards away at this point. So this was just considered to be a gesture of relief rather than any serious intent to cause casualties. But do you know what? They brewed up a tank. They brewed up another German tank at 2,200 yards. They normally wouldn't even bother attempting a shot at that distance, but they thought, what can we lose? Well, they scored another victory from the jaws of, I suppose you could call it a defeat. So at 2100 hours, they thought, right, we're not being relieved. We're going to just send out the wounded, the most severely wounded, in what vehicles we can scrape together that are still working. About 5 of the carriers were still working. A couple of jeeps were still working. Miraculously, there was a lorry that had been there all day. No one knew why it hadn't left earlier. And the thing was riddled with machine gun bullets, but what do you know? It still started and the wheels still went round and round. So they used that as well. And they got the non-walking wounded out. And they were still waiting for relief, and when they realized that it was 22:30 hours, they thought, okay, relief isn't coming, so guys, we're going to have to leave all the dead here, sorry, and anyone walking wounded, you help each other out, and we're just going to have to walk back. And a few of the men didn't make it back and died in the slog back across 1.5 miles of open country back to friendly lines. The next day, the infantry that was supposed to have relieved them was found miles to the south. But there you go. Fog of war. People end up in the wrong position. It had happened for the people involved in Snipe, so they couldn't really blame others for being in a similar situation. And there was a divisional board of inspectors put together to look, a few days later, look at the area, count all the wrecks, and try to work out just what had happened here and just how much damage has been done to the enemy. And they estimated that between 52 and 58 enemy vehicles had been knocked out. 15 to 20 had been knocked out and towed away by the enemy. But even so, they reckon that 1 day's fighting around that 1 unit of anti-tank guns had destroyed 10% of Rommel's tank force in North Africa. It was an extraordinarily successful action. There was, of course, a price to be paid for this. When they were walking back, they were carrying the sights and the breech blocks of the 6 remaining anti-tank guns, which they had no transports to move, so they were just abandoned. So ultimately they lost, I suppose you could say, all of the anti-tank guns. Maybe some of them got recovered later, I don't know. And they lost 2 officers and 12 other ranks were killed, 17 officers and 30 other ranks were wounded. But that's far less than the enemy had lost. And you'll notice as well the disproportionate number of officers amongst that. It's the way with the British Army. The British Army, because of the way the officers behave, a lot of them don't like ducking, and they suffer disproportionately high casualties. Now, Turner ends his report with this quote, which is an interesting one, I find, because it's drawing attention to his modesty. So is he boasting about his modesty? Because you can't really... Modesty is not something you can boast about. So he seems to be, I try to have it both ways here. But his account is still modest in a number of ways. He completely neglects to mention, for instance, that he won the Victoria Cross. He completely neglects to mention, for instance, that he'd taken 40 prisoners of the enemy as well. He completely neglects to mention that when he was crewing that anti-tank gun, he got hit and severely wounded in the head by a chunk of shrapnel and refused treatment until the action was over. And then later in the day, back at HQ in the bunker, he was hallucinating that he was in command of a harbour being attacked by enemy ships, and was reported as at one point shouting, "To sink that destroyer!" Before he pulled himself together later. He didn't mention that in his account. A modest enough guy, it seems. So there you go, a VC1, 10% of the enemy knocked out, and the 6-pounder shown that it was a flipping good gun.